We've been discussing progress and hopes for the future, but these hopes can take many forms, and not just based upon the expansion of industrial production, and not just based upon the expansion of the franchise, but also hopes for the future that would include hope for national self-determination and freedom from political oppression. That is, the freedom of nations to function freely so that they can, in fact, determine their own futures and determine their own sense of hope according to principles that they themselves identify as most appropriate for their group. One of the most powerful forces unleashed in the 19th century was that of nationalism, and it owed much to the French Revolution and to the Napoleonic Wars. To understand the complexity of nationalism in Europe, it's necessary to return briefly to the early years of the 19th century. By seeing nationalism as a fundamental engine of change on the continent, paralleling and occasionally associated with liberalism, we can appreciate the manifold nature of the pressures on traditional and conservative European society. Nationalism has been called the most important religion of the 19th century. It was irrational, based on the unexamined belief that some nations are better than others, or that people of the same ethnic origin, or people who share the same principles or ideals based upon national characteristics should live together in a nation state to rule over themselves. Because this nation state would then reflect their similar histories, their language, their religion, and their social structure. But it was often contradictory, because it identified certain nations or races as worthy of self-determination, while it neglected the national aspirations of others, leading in the end to conflicts which continued to shape the continent. Europe was a highly complex mix of peoples and states whose boundaries had shifted as a result of wars, dynastic marriages, and diplomacy, usually with little attention paid to the national origins of the inhabitants. After the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, national movements began to arise that were hostile to monarchies, hostile to empires, and also hostile to foreign occupiers of any kind. As we saw in an earlier lecture, the French Revolutionary and later Napoleonic armies helped to bring down the old order by dismantling these composite states and these aristocratic monarchical structures, replacing them first with republics, and then Bonaparte, principalities and kingdoms, occupying thrones from Napoleon's own family. For example, the autonomous Poland that was known as the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, created by Napoleon out of part of the territory of what had been the old Kingdom of Poland, was free from Prussian, Russian, and Austrian control, those nations that had partitioned the kingdom in the 18th century. And Italy was at least described as an entity when Napoleon made his stepson, Eugène de Beauharnais, the son of his wife Josephine, the Viceroy of Italy. And when Napoleon himself had a son, he gave the son the title, the King of Rome. So there was at least a recognition that Italy as something other than a geographical expression existed. But many other European states, freed from one overlord by the revolutionary or Napoleonic campaigns, were not terribly happy to be under another, even the French. Consequently, the Neapolitans, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Germans, their national self-consciousness raised by Napoleon, rose up to drive out the French. The Congress of Vienna, that met in 1814-1815, was a great success in stabilizing post-war Europe, but it was not seen as a success by the nationalists. The nationalists wanted their own rulers to ensure that something resembling a nation-state might emerge from the turmoil of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. But both liberalism and nationalism were associated with the French Revolution. Thus, the Vienna settlement paid little attention to the nationalist question. Austria, for example, regained its former territories in northern Italy, as well as being granted the ancient Venetian Republic in compensation for land lost elsewhere. So not only did Austria receive the territories that it had lost through the Napoleonic invasions, but also the Venetian Republic that had existed as a freestanding state for 1,100 years before Napoleon finally put an end to it in 1797, was given to the Austrians as well, rounding out their territories, but then providing another state that was ruled by foreign oppression. And despite Napoleon's effort to unite Germany and Italy, the victors of 1815 left the German Confederation a very loose organization, while Italy continued to be ruled by foreign governors and controlled by foreign troops. All of Europe agreed to this at Vienna, and that agreement would remain in force for nearly half a century. The great powers suppressed any movements which might call for self-determination or some degree of political independence, just as they attempted to suppress radicalism and any form of revolutionary activity. In Germany, for example, after the end of the Congress of Vienna, the Carlsbad Decrees of 1820 imposed strict censorship and surveillance, allowing the Prussian government to suppress free speech. Nevertheless, despite this attempt on the part of most of the established monarchies that emerged from the Congress of Vienna, revolts did break out, but these were very quickly suppressed by foreign or domestic troops. We have to remember the alliance system at Vienna and exactly what happened. The alliance system worked particularly well because all of the great powers agreed that those things that had been spawned by the French Revolution, those diseases that had emerged from that terrible event, had to be contained and ultimately had to be suppressed. And nationalism was seen as one of them. Nationalism was the fruit of this revolution that had so challenged and indeed endangered the entire continent. Moreover, nationalism, as we'll see, was so closely associated with liberalism that it was necessary to suppress them both together. National self-aspiration also reflected the desire for political freedom, broadly extended over that same group of people who shared the same ethnic origin or the same cultural values. Well, the first of these revolutions, after the Congress of Vienna, at least the first that really represented a successful moment in the attempt to change the geography of a continent determined at Vienna, was 1830. The revolutions of 1830 were sparked by the overthrow of Charles X in France during the July days, an event that we've seen. But this revolution reverberated across Europe, sparking other revolutions. Because as we saw in previous lectures, and we'll see again, the French had a tendency to export their revolutions or to serve as the inspiration for others. What was successful in Paris could be seen then as the model for what might happen elsewhere. The Poles, for example, rebelled against their Russian overlords in 1830, a rebellion suppressed with great cruelty. And there were disturbances in Belgium, Germany, and Italy. But only in France were there significant gains, with the last Bourbon king, Charles X, sent into exile and Louis-Philippe placed upon his throne. But although liberalism was an issue in France, nationalism was not. France was a relatively homogeneous state, and nationalism was not one of the forces that actually drove that 1830 revolution. But nationalism was, though, central to the events in the German-speaking lands. Those lands of Central Europe, dominated by not only the great Austrian Empire, that composite empire in the center of the continent, but also the German-speaking territories that had not been united at Vienna. While the German states moved in the direction of unification, and we will see this process developing as the Confederation began to use some of the glue of a common language and culture in order to create a nation-state, the Austrian Empire was being faced with the problem of how to control the nationalities and the ethnicities within its composite state. The Austrian Empire was a mosaic. It was a mosaic of nationalities, including, just to name the largest, Germans, Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Poles, Serbs, Croatians, and Italians. The degree of national feeling within each of these groups varied dramatically, depending on the sophistication of their social structure and their historical development. The Poles, for example, had had a glorious independent history in the Kingdom of Poland, a powerful and rich state in Central Eastern Europe, before the partitions. And the Polish nobility and gentry, the szlachta, had strong particularist feelings and strong national identification, not only as members of the Catholic Church, but also as part of a special group of individuals within Central Europe that had the responsibility to keep their culture vibrant and alive. This group of the nobility and gentry resented enormously having their nation divided amongst the Russians, Prussians, and Austrians. The Hungarians also had a long history, and some Hungarians resented the rule of the Austrian Habsburgs. But here, because the crown had been acquired through dynastic descent, Hungary had some special privileges. Hungary did enjoy local independence, as the crown was in fact just shared between the kingdoms of Hungary and the various other composite kingdoms of the Habsburg Empire. Similarly, the Crown of Bohemia had itself been recognized as a constituent kingdom, despite the repression that occurred during the 30 Years' War. The Austrians, however, were experienced and skilled at managing these tensions, especially by establishing an efficient bureaucracy that ran the empire, and that also very, very cleverly played the landowners against the peasantry in order to maintain control. Peasants, because of their lack of social sophistication, education, and not really developing a voice of their own, had very, very little national feeling. They had no powerful sense of national self-identification, but they were powerfully abused by their masters. They were poorly treated by the landlords, and so the Austrian imperial government was able to capitalize on this division and protect the peasants from their landlords, or so they said. In exactly the same way, the Austrians balanced the various nationalities, playing one nationality against another. Vienna was seen then largely as benevolent to the peasantry, who were often of different national origins from their landlords. Hungarians, for example, might be the landlord class, but Slavs represented the peasants on their estates. This kind of problem resulted in not just national tension, but also class tensions, which complicated an already difficult situation. Because what the emperor and the imperial policy succeeded in doing was to ensure support among the lower orders of society by making the emperor and his government the protectors of the poor, the peasants, and those who had little national feeling but had a strong sense of fear of those who in fact controlled their lives, their landlords. This made it clear then to that aristocratic class, the landowning gentry and nobility, and also their urban middle-class intellectual associates, so closely associated often in Central Europe with the nobility, that if revolution were to occur, the peasants would remain loyal to the Habsburg Empire, as the emperor and his laws were the only protection that they enjoyed against the landlord class, a class that was characterized as among the most rapacious on the continent. Moreover, in Eastern Europe, monarchs also had to consider another type of nationalist movement, best described as supranational. The most important supranationalist movement was Pan-Slavism. Before the revolutions of 1848, Pan-Slavism was a cultural movement, similar to the cultural movements that spawned nationalism in Germany and in Italy, mostly devoted to literature and art and a shared cultural background, a shared sense of experience. But Pan-Slavism was somewhat exclusive. It did not look at sharing the Slavic experience with the rest of Europe. It looked inward and evolved in response to Western European ideas, largely in opposition to these ideas, which were often identified as corrupting and corrosive to the special mission and character of the Slavic people. The movement was meant to link the Slavs, all of the Slavs of Eastern Europe, emphasizing the values and traditions that bound them together, and also that separated them from and differentiated them from those of Western Europe. Thus, Pan-Slavism was strongly supported by the Eastern Orthodox Church, which stressed Slavic spirituality and a superior spirituality that linked the Eastern Slavs with the Byzantine Empire. The belief that Russia had become the third Rome after the city of Rome itself and then Constantinople, and then with the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, Orthodox religion had now moved to Russia. So Russia was the third Rome, and the autocracy of the Russian Tsar and the Slavic racial affinity to Russia, which was, after all, the only major independent Slavic power, called for a brotherhood of Slavic peoples. And this brotherhood was, to some extent, cemented together by Eastern Orthodox religion, but not exclusively. But it did expect that there be support for the liberation of all Slavs, especially from the rule of those who were not Slavs themselves. Hostility then to their German or their Turkish Ottoman overlords. Alexander I of Russia had provided the impetus for this movement. He supported nascent Slavic nationalism in the Balkans, because after all, the Turks, we must remember, ruled large sections of the Balkans up until the beginning of the 20th century. The Pan-Slavists directed then much hostility against the Turks because of their control of Slavic peoples in the Balkan Peninsula, in what is now Bulgaria and the southern Slavs of the peninsula. So Pan-Slavists called for insurrections, called for revolutions by Slavs against the Ottomans in Europe, which then the Russians would support. The Russians would then come as the liberator to ensure that all Slavic peoples would ultimately be free, and the ties between Russia and the fellow Slavic nations would be thereby tightened, and the Russians then could speak for the Slavic peoples as their natural protector and as their natural spokesman. Well, it was these complex nationalist sentiments, combined with liberalism, that brought about the revolutions of 1848. Once again, they began in France, which seems to be the place where most revolutions start, with the Revolution of February 1848 that toppled Louis Philippe and led to the formation of the Second Republic under Louis Napoleon, as we saw earlier. There then followed a revolution in Austria, where the Hungarians, led by Louis Kossuth, sought to dissolve the union between Austria and Hungary. Because remember, they were separate states, and the union was the union only of the crown in the person of the head of the House of Habsburg. What's more, once this rebellion broke out in Vienna, liberal German students then rose up against the Emperor Ferdinand, driving his court from the city, as well as the poor old emperor himself. Ferdinand was the wrong man at the wrong time. Ferdinand was not a gifted human being. In fact, he was actually severely mentally handicapped. When the revolution broke out, his court immediately panicked, and his army said, there's a revolution in the city. Ferdinand's reply was, because it was dinner time, revolution, revolution. I don't care for revolution, I want my noodles, because it was dinner time, and dinner, of course, was what concerned him the most. There was a lovely element, though, of a kind of cosmic justice, because when this revolution overthrew Ferdinand and the liberal German students took over the city of Vienna, Metternich, who had remained the head of the Austrian government, who was still the spokesman for this conservative position, the individual who tried to make the clock stand still, was still the spokesman for the House of Habsburg in 1848. The only way that he could get out safely from the city was to have his servants hide him in a laundry basket under his own dirty laundry. So there, in fact, is a moment of justice as the old reactionary was smuggled out of his palace covered with his own dirty clothes. Appropriately humiliating for a man who so successfully humiliated so many others. The revolutionary students in Vienna then were initially successful. And they were so successful, they threw their support completely behind the others revolting against the Habsburgs. They stopped, for example, the Austrian soldiers who had been mobilized to suppress the revolution in Hungary from boarding trains that would take them there. And moderates and conservatives in Vienna, though, wondered what to do. The students were not only nationalists, but they were mostly liberals. They were committed to a set of liberal principles that most of the conservatives, and even many of those in support of the conservatives, but not in a position of privilege or power, felt to be inappropriate for what was happening at that moment in European history. So the conservatives remained loyal to the emperor. Similarly, much of the peasantry outside the city remained loyal to the emperor and the Habsburgs. This created again a tension between peasant and landlord, adding again that class element to an already complex and dangerous situation. Vienna, however, was retaken for the emperor by the army and the revolution suppressed. There was simply not enough support. The students held out for a long period of time. The liberals barricaded the streets, but it was impossible because they lacked the support to actually effect a revolution that had very deep roots. And despite liberal calls for a constitution, most of the power remained in the hands of the army, which completely and universally supported the Habsburgs. We should note as well that poor Ferdinand was deposed, being unable really to manage the situation, and he was replaced by the 18-year-old Franz Joseph. And this was the emperor that was to rule over Austria-Hungary until his death in 1916 during the First World War, and was then the penultimate Habsburg emperor to rule that great empire. The emperor initially decided to make some concessions to the liberal students in order to try and build some measure of support. So he accepted the Hungarian claims for greater autonomy, and he even granted Kossuth and his supporters a constitution. Similarly, accommodations were made for the Kingdom of Bohemia. Seeing the success in Hungary and seeing the Hungarians being given a constitution in this moment of chaos, the Italians used the upheaval of 1848 to advance their cause. Nationalist uprisings in Milan, Naples, Venice, and Rome produced spectacular, if brief, success, with the Habsburgs, the Pope, and the Bourbons driven from their thrones temporarily. For much of 1848, it looked as though the Austrian Empire was about to disintegrate, and the conservative Europe was going to be reconstructed along liberal nationalist lines. It seemed then that the liberals and the nationalists were actually, for a while, going to live, actually going to win. But in the end, the inability of the liberals and the nationalists to work together, the realities of European politics, and the military power of Austria and Russia defeated the revolutionaries. The ethnic complexity of composite states like the Habsburg Empire made the success of these revolts extraordinarily unlikely. And this is perhaps best illustrated in the events of the Kingdom of Bohemia. Many of the leading intellectuals in Prague were Germans. After all, it was one of the capitals of the Holy Roman Empire. It was, in fact, a city that was very closely associated with the German elite that was the dominant class in the Habsburg Empire. And so it was only reasonable that many of the professional classes and professional intellectuals would be of German descent and where German was generally spoken. So the Germans in Bohemia thought it was appropriate to accept an invitation from the German Diet being held at Frankfurt, the Diet of the German Confederation, which invited the Czechs to become part of this German Confederacy, this hope that the German nation might be united on the platform of the German Confederation. This was seen, of course, as a hope in 1848, that German unification would be one of the consequences, as it was one of the goals of these revolutions. However, the Slavic Czechs had no desire whatsoever to be a minority in the German Confederation. They knew this experience. They were a minority in the Austrian Empire. So why would they possibly want to have Bohemia linked to the German Confederation, where the Slavs would be a tiny minority in a great German state? So in Prague, a pan-Slavist conference was held. The Slavic Czechs decided that they would counter the request for Bohemian participation in the German Confederation by having, in fact, a Slavist meeting that would allow the Slavic peoples within the Habsburg Empire to come together, those who chose to be under the Habsburg crown, to defend their interests as Slavic peoples in a multinational state, rather than be subjects of the new German state should one arise. This, of course, was to some extent a declaration of war against the Germans. So, in fact, what happened is that street fighting broke out in Prague between the Czechs and the German factions. The street fighting resulted in a kind of stasis, and it became clear that the division would allow then the Habsburg to ultimately come and restore Bohemia to the Habsburg crown. An Austrian army entered the city, restoring it to the Habsburg Empire, ending the revolt. Again indicating that the various nationalities were not in a position to work closely enough together in order to achieve goals that would be of benefit to everyone. Nationalism is exclusive. German nationalism excluded the Slavs, Slavic nationalism excluded the Germans, so it was impossible for them to work in order to achieve the common goals of creating a single state. The Italian provinces of the Habsburg Empire saw a situation that was very similar. Early victories led to infighting amongst the nationalist groups, divided as they were by competing objectives and geographical and local imperatives. Some of the groups in Italy were Republicans. Others were Roman Catholics looking towards the Pope to provide some measure of unity in the Italian peninsula. Others were monarchists looking for a monarch that would unite Italy. And with these competing goals, they were unable to work to ensure that an independent Italy would arise from the foreign domination that had existed before 1848. And the other thing about Italy is that they didn't have a military force. There wasn't an army that could defend these revolutions against the Austrians and others. So the Austrians returned, regained control of Venetia and Lombardy, silencing the nationalists and the revolutionaries and reimposing Habsburg rule until the Risorgimento, that movement of Italian national unification that happened in the next decade. Finally, in Hungary, Kossuth and his supporters were opposed by other groups who had been given special rights by the emperor under the Habsburg crown. It was clear that Kossuth was a Magyar. He was a Hungarian, and he could count on the support of all of the Hungarians, in fact, the commitment of the Hungarian people for the recreation of a Hungarian kingdom. But what would that kingdom constitute? Would it be the old kingdom of Hungary that had large numbers of Slavs in it, or would it be a new kingdom? And of course, the desire was to reconstitute the full ancient kingdom of Hungary, which would require then that Slavs would support this revolution. But the minorities, such as the Slovaks, the Slovenes, the Croatians, who lived within the historical Hungarian kingdom, didn't want to be controlled by Budapest. They in fact saw it as much more dangerous than being controlled by Vienna. They had much more affinity, in fact, with Vienna, in part because the Viennese bureaucracy, that imperial Habsburg ability to play one group off against another, had actually benefited the minority groups within the Kingdom of Hungary. The Slavs in particular had been given significant privileges and significant freedoms that they knew they would lose under the Hungarians. Moreover, Kossuth's tactics in dealing with these minorities were just as brutal as the Austrian methods of dealing with the Hungarian nationalists. Kossuth began a policy of Magyarization. In other words, Hungarian was going to be the official language, and you had to be able to speak it. That Hungarian traditions and culture was going to be the dominant tradition and culture, and so consequently, you had to then make your Slavic culture secondary and practice it only locally. This was something that the Slavic minorities in the Kingdom of Hungary refused to recognize. So Croatian forces waged a civil war against Kossuth, further widening the divisions in Hungary and permitting the Austrians to mobilize an army and reassert control. And in fact, it was a Croatian general, Croatian nobleman, Baron Jelačić, that ultimately entered Hungary and suppressed the Kossuth rebellion. Kossuth was defeated and exiled, bringing to an end the 1848 revolutions within the Austrian Empire. There were other consequences of the failed 1848 revolutions as well in the Habsburg lands. The imperial system was concentrated, centralized, and focused as the separate kingdoms of Hungary and Bohemia, which previously, remember, had just shared the same Habsburg monarch, were incorporated into a more centralized imperial state. The remaining serfs were freed by the emperor, in part because of their loyalty to the Habsburgs during the revolt, and also to cement the belief that the emperor remained their protector against their landlords. This paternalistic view was that the Habsburg would protect the poor in the countryside, and it was necessary for them to show loyalty to the imperial government rather than to their landlords. The law code was reformed to reinforce the centralization of the empire, and there was an attempt to improve transportation and communication, to further reinforce the state's control over the non-German populations. Tariff barriers were erected to make the empire economically self-sufficient and united, and in fact interdependent. Conscious policies to put together an empire that would be economically interdependent so that raw materials from one area would be taken to another to be fabricated, that mines in one area would provide the raw material for factories in another, and so on. And this was a territory just beginning its industrialization, and the Austrians were willing to support this, in fact encourage it, in order to strengthen their rule. Railroads, after all, moved troops as well as civilian passengers, and economic policies to protect nascent industries bought the support of the industrial rich and their managers, that new class rising in Central Europe that ultimately would prove to be particularly loyal to the House of Habsburg. And a process of Austrianization took place, making knowledge of German mandatory for success, especially for the professional classes. Despite the failures of 1848, the revolutions illustrated the internal tensions within the polyglot Austrian Empire, tensions that would drive imperial Habsburg policy until the complete collapse of the empire after World War I. Before this cataclysmic disintegration of Habsburg power, other national movements of self-determination challenged the integrity of that empire and also the integrity of others. In the next lecture, we will turn to the two great unification movements of the 1860s, the creation of Italy and the Risorgimento, and the creation of Germany. Events that were simultaneous and in many ways that reflected the same kinds of ambitions and accomplished by similar means. But nevertheless, what we see is that the movements of the 1860s were in so many ways continuations and extensions of the 1848 revolution, a time when the principles of liberalism and nationalism were determined and which allowed these powerful emotions and powerful principles to become the engines of a new Europe, creating more nation states based upon the assumption that people with similar language, ethnicity, culture, and traditions should live together, and often at the expense of their neighbors who did not share those things.